I'm gonna record
See if I
now.
can get somewhere. Hang on, I'm going to put on a little more light for details.
Yes.
Um, Tell me a little bit about the website. What's the website?
Oh, I can actually show you
Okay.
some of the website if I can get it up quick enough, because I know you don't have that much time. I'm actually headed to Niagara Falls later on today,
Oh,
which is very exciting.
for fun, for work, for
For fun. It's my birthday on Monday,
happy
so
early birthday.
thank you. It's an early birthday trip. Um, and so yeah, let me share my screen with you. Share screen, yes. So this is how the website's looking so far. And we don't have any interviews uploaded, but within the next couple of weeks, we'll have. Do you see the?
Mhm. I can see it.
So essentially, we'll have conversations. Will be all here.
Cool.
Scrolling down. This is
Hmm.
just. These are just fillers that the website that Squarespace gives you.
Hmm.
But yeah, it'll be here, and then we'll have stuff about our lab. We'll have
Hmm.
things about the conference. We'll have contact information. So, yeah,
Beautiful.
that's pretty much it so far. Thank you. Can we talk about a little bit about your grad school, and then we can kind of segue into future of education, your experience in your past education.
Absolutely. So I'll start with my, kind of the way I came up through education. I'll go all the way back. I went to elementary and high school in the suburbs of Connecticut, where I was, one of, there were, in some cases there were like 4 people of color in the school, and one of them was my brother, and 2 of the other people were related to each other. So it's very, very few people of color growing up. And then I came to
Me
NYU for
too.
undergrad. What's that?
Me too.
It's interesting when you think back on that whole experience and you're like, ooh, there were some things that were problematic about that. Um,
Definitely.
and so, I went to undergrad at NYU. I studied economics and I got a minor in Spanish, and I had an internship. And at that internship, I kept getting in trouble because I was falling asleep at the desk. I learned that desk work was not for me. And I really enjoyed my life and my work as an RA, resident assistant in housing. And I had a really wonderful mentor who said, hey, why don't you try out Teach for America? And I said, all right, I'll try it. And I went to an information session, and given my kind of false sense of my sort of falsely placed hope and my unrealistic belief in meritocracy, in thinking that a meritocracy exists, in thinking that people like me were supposed to be saving people somewhere else. I thought Teach for America is it, and
Mm-hmm.
I joined. Um, I was accepted. I joined. I taught in the South Bronx, and very, very quickly I learned, okay, so I don't think that how I thought about kids in schools, in poor schools, was right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I thought that kids in really tough schools needed to be saved. And that could not be further from the truth. I learned that, in fact, my job was to really better understand the children and better understand their families and their community. And I started to understand we need to move away from thinking about helping kids like get out of where they live, but maybe actually help kids think about what's beautiful about where they live and how do they
Yeah.
want to improve it? How do they see themselves in that space?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I started asking a lot of questions about why schools seem to be so unfair. Um, I remember this one project I had the kids do, and this is my second year of teaching. I was also social studies teacher. I was math and social studies, and you know,
Math and social studies.
so yes, so it's
Wow.
pretty common practice that there are 2 test subjects in a lot of schools. Math and ELA in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd say largely in the country as well. But the money is spent on putting teachers in math and ELA, and then the schedules are also set up so the most amount of time is spent in math and ELA because those are the tested subjects.
Yeah. Makes
And
sense.
so there often isn't budget to put in an entirely different position for a social studies or science teacher. So under contract, it was okay to do this. The schools have their math and ELA teachers teach math and one other subject like science or social studies.
Mhm, mhm.
And so that year I was math and social studies. Um, and so we did this unit on like redesigning the school
Mhm, mhm.
as part of a social studies unit. It was embedded in discussion of ancient civilizations. We were studying India at the time, and I was describing to them, the Shiva, who was the god, the destroyer of evil. And I said, okay, so all three of these gods, Brahma, Shiva, and I'm gonna forget the third. What a bad Indian. There's like these three gods who are responsible for
Yeah.
kind of uh, helping the world continue. And I said, now pretend that you're one of those three and like redesign this school. And it was so interesting because the kids were saying, you know, the first thing I would do is I would make it look less like a prison,
Wow,
right?
they
Like
said
they
that?
looked at the house. Yeah, when they looked at the outside of the building, when they looked at the furniture inside the school, they said the very first thing that most kids said was, it kind of feels like a prison because there's bars on the windows outside.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and it didn't feel like a welcoming space all the time. And so that was that really that along with several other things that happened in the school got me thinking, like, why is it this way? Why should it be this way for like, why are we setting up schools in this extremely segregated way? um, and so I taught for several more years in the Bronx. I taught until I taught at one other school, and then I was not able to answer all my questions about why outcomes were so different and treated so differently in different spaces. Why, if you lived in the suburbs, um, the emphasis was on extracurriculars, the emphasis was on your college application.
Mhm, mhm.
But when you lived in the Bronx, the emphasis was on we need our school to get a certain number of kids with this test score. It's just a very different set of expectations.
Mhm.
I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out why it had been that way. Um, and so I joined at NYU in a PhD program at the time, which it was called, what was it called? Urban Education
Mhm.
in Steinhardt. During my time there, it was changed to teaching and learning. So my degree is in
Okay.
teaching and learning. So I worked with Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Mhm.
He was my dissertation chair, and he really taught me so much about what it means to listen and relate to students, to think about how and why structural racism persists in schools
Mhm, mhm.
and interrogate that factor. Like, don't try to name it as anything else except what it is, which is,
Yes, exactly.
this is the this is racism operating at fundamental levels,
Yeah,
both overtly and covertly.
yeah. It's
And
embedded
so
in the system. It's part
deeply
of
so.
the system. Yeah. So you have to deconstruct the system in order
Yes,
to, rebuild.
that's right. That's exactly right. I also got to work, Dr. Josh Aronson was on my committee as well. And, I undertook a study of teachers' beliefs about grading. That
Mm.
was my dissertation study.
Oh,
Um,
awesome.
yeah, it was very interesting. It was a very interesting project, I must say. I mean, it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into a dissertation, but it was a very interesting project. I learned a lot about the stress and pressure that teachers face when assigning grades, particularly in the city,
Mhm,
because of like how school choice operates. How students from middle school start to get tracked into certain high schools,
mhm, mhm.
and the
How does
way that
that work specifically?
good question. So this was back, and so the disclaimer here is that this is back from just 4 or 5 years ago, and now things change policy wise in New York City pretty rapidly. So I'm not 100% sure if this is still the case. I would be willing to bet it is. So what happens in New York City is kids are zoned for their middle schools, right? So you go to your zone middle school if you can. There are ways, though, that certain schools are attended by certain groups of people who have figured out how they can get their kids into those schools.
Mm,
Whether that be by, playing a little, figuring out how to own an apartment in a certain district so that you have residents and you can be zoned in.
oh yeah.
There's certain practices that happen under the surface like this. So certain schools, there will be certain pockets of schools that are very well resourced and they have very strong PTAs. And so it kind of starts even before middle school. But needless to say, we get to this middle school time. And so for for the high school application process, there are those top tier schools, the specialized high schools you test in. And if you look at the demographics of those schools, you'll find that they are attended by predominantly white and Asian students. There's been a lot of news about Stuyvesant High School from a few years ago, where you could see that they're so racially segregated as compared to other schools. Then there are these other tiers of schools that you have to apply to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And what they consider when you apply to the schools are your seventh grade grades and test scores.
Seventh grade.
Mhm. Because in eighth grade, you apply. So you submit your seventh grade information.
That's so much pressure.
It's so much pressure. And so I got to understand a little of that pressure from the teacher's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I also got a sense of how students experience this process of evaluation in schools. It's really kind of crazy. The kids are asked to understand so many different systems of grading. In a given day, if you have 6 different classes, you might be getting assessed 6 different ways. And you have to sort of make sense of that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then on top of that, you also carry with you what your math and ELA scores are. So if you ask a kid, I mean, there was a couple of instances where in my teaching career, it really broke my heart when kids would say to me, you know what, though, I'm a 2. And I would say, what do you mean you're a 2? I'm a 2. Well, that's my math score. I got a 2 on the math exam in 5th grade. So I'm a 2. And so, yeah, I hope to be a 3 this year. And I'm thinking to myself, man, oh man, this is so damaging in terms of your math identity, how you kind of see
Mhm.
yourself as a mathematician, that you put yourself in these boxes and they're so arbitrary how those scores are determined. Um,
Like there's no room for growth or evolution
right.
at all. With and also I feel like a lot of kids in urban areas may have other, things to worry about, right? Other than school. And so now it's like adding on this pressure, right? Adding on like so many different stressors. And so, yeah, how can someone who has other stresses at a young age be able to, score high and not have test anxiety, right? Even if they know the information and it's like all this test anxiety, all this pressure, and now they don't perform well. Now that's more pressure, it's more stress
Mhm.
because they it's just like a domino effect. And then you don't have teachers who understand the students either. So that's
Right.
like everybody's the enemy at
Mhm.
that point. So you kind of feel alone. And so it's just like more
Yeah,
problems upon more problems upon more problems.
it really is, and it starts with the pressures of testing. It really does, and those pressures come at the children from all sides, and it's troubling. It's deeply troubling. Um, I tried to explain to my students as best I could, and to their families, and to their caregivers. When you take a test on a certain day, the score you get is a measure of your performance
Yeah,
on that day, and
exactly.
that's it. If you, the exact same person, took this exact same test on another day, there is a good possibility you would get a different score.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how could we say that this is, as a test, a measure of your ability, a measure of your capacity to learn? That's really different from a test being a measure of your performance on a day, on a specific
Yeah.
day. So that's really hard to communicate, though, because for young people living in marginalized communities, when they take the tests, there's just so much riding on it for them and for their families. Um, if you score a 1 on the math or the ELA state exam, you automatically receive something called the promotion in doubt letter. And it's highly likely that you're going to go to summer school.
Oh no.
Right. Now, mind you, these tests are scored on a 4-point scale. You get a 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure.
So how do we mediate these issues? These or mediate the effects? Do we change the whole system? How can we, because we do need testing, right? Because we obviously need to assess students in some sort of way, but how can we do that in a way that's not damaging to the students, not damaging to the teachers?
That's a really good question. And I think right now is the time to start figuring this out because we are in this year that is unlike any other. We are learning some really important lessons about how kids engage
Mhm.
with one another and with their teachers in these virtual spaces. This is the year to figure it out. And so, how to do it? I mean, I have always been a proponent of giving the test back to the students for starters.
Oh, that's good.
If we want to look at which schools need additional resources and we need some indicator of how well the students are doing, I think that there are more ways than one to give um, like a more textured analysis of student progress in the school. Could we
Hmm.
take maybe a composite score of a couple of tests across a couple of days, and then maybe add in there some portfolio assessment, right? Let's
Yeah.
look at student work. I think we have the manpower to do it. If you look at, I mean, I would be curious to learn about just how much money, the big testing companies like Pearson pour in to create and then analyze the tests.
Hmm.
I wonder if some of those resources could be redirected to to sort of add more nuance to this picture that we get about students' performance and ability.
Yes. Because
Uh,
I never got my state tests back. And I was always wondering, I mean, I got a score, like a percentile, and then that's it,
right,
right? But how are students supposed to learn if they don't know their mistakes?
right. That's
And
right. Yeah.
these tests are just such a big part of our curriculum.
Mhm.
And we're really just focusing on the score, which is the problem. And then teachers will tell you it's not about the score, it's about the learning. But then their actions say differently.
That's
So,
exactly right. That's exactly right. And and I've been there as a teacher, and I know what that feels like to kind of both, be formally and informally evaluated based on your students' test scores.
mhm,
So, and that's a whole nother conversation, right, about teacher evaluation and how it's pegged on students' test scores. Um, it's a lot of pressure on the teachers as well,
mhm,
to
mhm.
sort of perform, to feel like you must perform in such a way that your students' test scores go up. Um, yeah, no, it's a, so I would say, what could we, back to this question of what could we do?
Mhm.
What might we do? I certainly think that there's room, like I said, to have multiple points of data that give you a more nuanced understanding of what a school might need. I think in terms of the state test, as you were saying, um, it makes you feel like, oh, wait a second, what just happened? You submit it, you get your score, but you want to know, how did you do on the thing?
Exactly.
So, if the test makers are turning over questions, I think that one thing we could do is, if they're throwing out a certain bank of questions each year and adding in a different bank of questions that they piloted, why not give the students back their work on those questions which they know they will throw out? There's no
Mhm.
harm in that to anyone, right? And the
Yeah.
students therefore would have this opportunity to learn. So, as a teacher, something that I do and that I have always done as a classroom teacher and as a faculty person in graduate school, as a TA, when I was teaching statistics courses at NYU. Um, I had an infinite, not a near infinite resubmit policy.
Mm,
So on any assignment, any quiz, any test, students could request to retake, and then I would regrade it and I would take the highest score.
that's awesome.
Always,
That's
always.
more work for you, and I think that's why a lot of people don't implement that.
That's one side of it, is the work side. The
Hmm.
other side of it, though, is ideological. The other side of it is this deep belief that the meritocracy works, and that you get ahead if you work hard.
Yeah.
But we know that is not true. We know that
Hmm.
for some people, when what is it? How do we define that hard work? We define it very differently for different groups of people, based on race, based on family income and wealth status, based on, you know, abled status. So it's certainly, the playing field, as has been well documented, is certainly not fair.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think? Why do you think a lot of teachers don't implement such policies like that currently?
I think there are several teachers who do. I
Hmm.
think, though, I'll take for example one of the
I never got teachers like that. I never got, only a few that probably I can count on my fingers that
yeah,
would actually let me resubmit work.
yeah.
And I feel like it's because a lot of teachers that I had were lazy and they
They could
actually
be.
didn't care.
It's tricky, because I've been on that side of it, and I don't want to say any of my former colleagues didn't extend love and care to their students if they didn't kind of follow a policy like this. I
Hmm.
think you're onto something when you're saying, it is a lot of work. I don't want to take away from that. It's a lot of work. But when you carefully design your assessments and you don't make them horrifically long or unnecessarily painful, then grading it's not so bad.
Hmm.
That's one piece of it. The other piece of it, I really do think, is, when you have, like, especially in a discipline like mathematics, there's this idea that there's an innate ability to do math. And
Yeah.
so, what in some teachers' minds, what exactly would a retake accomplish?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
in their minds, it doesn't actually, it's not fair to, as they may think of it, they may say, this isn't fair, to who or to what, I'm unclear on, but it's not fair to allow students to retake a test because they will have already, I don't know, memorized the answers from the test before, or something like that. But I can tell you that that's just not the case. Like, if the kids want to retake a test, they probably got a lot of it wrong, and they probably
Yeah.
don't know the right
Yeah.
answers anyway.
I,
So
yeah. I hear a common thread of like the mentality of the teachers.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that maybe on how the subject needs to be, how the subject should be perceived, how
Right.
students learn, a fundamental understanding of how students learn. And you, like, you got your PhD in that. So obviously you know a lot about that. But a lot of teachers, they have a passion for a subject and they teach it, or
Mhm.
they're given a subject to teach. And so that understanding of like how students learn and um, that growth mindset isn't really, I guess, understood or even thought about.
Right.
So, do you think teachers need maybe training on growth mindset, how
Absolutely.
to understand the students better? Because I feel like that's also what you mentioned a lot before, understanding love, compassion, all these things that may be lacking in schools.
Exactly. Because, and it's not for lack of love on the part of the teachers.
Hmm.
I'm hard pressed to name, out of the hundreds of teachers I have worked with, I would be hard pressed to name for you even 10 teachers who I could say, are not or should not be teachers, because they don't love children, and they don't love school, and they don't love the work they do. They're few and far between. The truth is, in my experience, teachers are feeling the stress and pressure to perform.
Yeah.
That ends up overshadowing what they would actually want to do. If they could do what they actually wanted to do, I
Hmm.
bet it would look a lot more loving and caring,
Okay.
right? So You asked me a question and I blanked on it. Um, you asked me
What question did I ask?
if the teachers need sort of some more training and guidance
Yeah,
on things, from the science, from what we know about the science of learning and development, which
exactly.
tells us about growth mindset and it tells us about what it looks like to, um, to approach work with curiosity, um,
Exactly. Yes.
things like this, right? So, absolutely, I think that that is certainly very important, and I think that beyond just studying the concepts, that teachers actually need to see examples.
Mm,
So some of the work I do at the graduate school where I'm a faculty member now, I show examples from my own teaching past of my grading policies that I used. I show examples of like, assignments, and I model for the pre-service teachers how to launch and engage students in like very rich tasks versus very sort of practice-based procedural tasks. I mean, that's where we start to infuse a little bit more growth mindset, a little bit more play, a little bit more curiosity. When there's like a real puzzle that's worthy of solving,
hmm
it's incredible to see how young people, how even a group of teachers, how a group of teachers will engage and get excited and be really invested.
hmm
So there has to be a change not only in how we do testing, as we talked about before, but also in how we structure the curriculum away from getting ready for a test.
Got it.
Um, Right. So one example of something I would do that really sort of is aligned well to this principle of growth mindset is that I would, if the students had, let's say, like a project of some kind, I would ask them to submit a draft in mathematics, which is kind of not a common thing, right? So submit a rough draft of your solution to a problem, or just show me where you are so far with this.
hmm
That concept is kind of foreign in a math classroom. And so I would take that and give feedback on it, honest, actionable feedback. And then the students would revise and resubmit. And then that's the thing I would grade.
That's
So
good.
it's kind of, yeah, like to borrow a little bit from this idea of like when you write drafts and then you improve your draft,
Yeah, and you
right?
can make mistakes without feeling like all of the consequences, I guess, of those mistakes.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and you can, yeah, and you're happy, not happy, but you're willing
Right.
to make mistakes because mistakes are part of life.
Yes.
How do you know what you're going to do in the future if you don't make mistakes about things that you want in the past? So
Hmm. Hmm.
I completely agree.
Right.
Let's talk about e-learning.
Sure.
How do you see e-learning and how can we improve it?
Boy, oh boy. So e-learning right now, in the time of the pandemic, it's a grand experiment because everyone has to do it. And so we are
It is
getting,
that's great. That's a great use. Yeah, that's a great term.
it's like we are forced to collect some interest, we are forced to collect the data on how e-learning is going right now across such a broad swath of settings, a broad swath of contexts. So, I mean, how is it going right now? I can tell you that one of the things that one of my colleagues is interested in studying, she's currently a teacher in Cambridge Public Schools here in Massachusetts. But something she wonders about is how all the students turn their video off in the Zoom in the Zoom calls for classes. And so typically it's just a series of, black screens
So
and
weird.
just the teacher, right? And so, how you get people to engage when you cannot see them?
Yes. You don't know what they're doing.
You don't know what they're doing. You can
They couldn't even, they might not even be there. They're just,
they're
you
just
know.
logged in, getting credit for being there. But we don't want to assume that, right? Because we have these incredible teachers who have come up with, like my colleague Cece, um, has just incredible ways of engaging the students and sort of acknowledging that screens are off and saying, hey, that's okay, right? Because we can still do a lot of math together. And
Nice.
so it's how do you use the tools that we have online to get students to participate?
Hmm
So one thing we're learning from e-learning is that there's a lot that goes behind why kids are going to black out their screens, why they don't want to be seen. And so there's some kind of, I think that that's worth exploring. Like, what is it about being on screen that is such a turnoff, or can be, what maybe another way to say it is, what feels safer about turning off your video,
Yeah. Yeah. I never
right?
thought about it like that. Yeah.
Why does it feel safe to you, and how, and so what can we learn from that? What do we learn from that? Another thing I'm noticing in terms of e-learning, is that teachers are really having a hard time with the quiet. So teachers are asking questions and are trying to get discussion to happen in e-learning spaces, and they're met often with silence. There's this real awkwardness that exists in, facilitating a class in an online setting, because in person there's this, there can often be this lovely murmur of chatter that's happening,
Hmm.
and you can play off of that as a teacher. So that, in that absence, I think that teachers are fairly stressed out by, honestly, by the silence.
Yeah. I think going back to what you were saying about students feeling uncomfortable, I think
Mhm,
it might have to do with like physically they're alone,
mhm,
but virtually they're in a space with other people. So
mhm.
it's like you're feeling as if everybody's on, like everybody's eyes are on you. So if I were to turn on my screen in like a big class, everyone's looking at me. Well, at least that's how I feel, right? I feel like everyone is just like watching me, maybe scrutinizing, and so that might be a reason why. I mean, I personally don't have issues with turning on my video, even when other people have their videos off, but that's just because I'm pretty comfortable in Zoom spaces.
Mhm.
But I feel like a lot of, even speaking, with speaking, I feel kind of like a little uncomfortable sometimes, just because like, I don't know, it's a weird space because I'm right now I'm alone. I look around my physical space, I'm alone, but I'm interacting with you, right? We're talking, we're looking at each other, but I can't
Right.
touch you at all. Or it's just weird. It's
Yeah.
just weird. Do you think people or kids, students, teachers will soon be more comfortable if we start to do this, more? If maybe we have if teachers, when they're doing their training,
Mhm.
have Zoom literacy sort of training part of their teacher training. I'm sure that that's going to happen soon, right?
I certainly hope it would. I wonder, though, if we have the manpower, if we have the cater of people who have expertise in this, and I wonder if we need to reach outside of education to
Mhm.
draw in people who know more about engaging in a virtual space.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think we really need to do, and I wonder if it's happening, is to get people who design video games
Mm,
to enter into the education conversation and talk to us. How do you get kids to sit and look at a screen and do stuff for hours?
yeah.
And they fail and they fail and they fail. And guess what? They keep playing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's a I'm forgetting the author's first name, but I think maybe it's something G. James Paul G has written about what video games can teach us about learning.
Mm,
And so I wonder if we can explore that more now. It is so pressing that we do that. So one group of people who I think need to be part of the e-learning conversation that aren't yet, at least not at the level that somebody like me knows about it going on. I mean, I hope it's happening somewhere. I need to see video game designers come into the conversation. I think we have a lot to learn from them.
yes.
The second thing I think needs to happen is, you know, it's it's wonderful that a lot of school districts immediately stepped up and sent Chromebooks home to the kids. So we get these, $150. I think that's what I don't know if that's what they still cost, but
Mm,
relatively inexpensive Chromebooks were given to anybody in schools who didn't have
sure.
a computer at home, right?
Yeah.
And this is pretty common practice, definitely here in Boston and in Cambridge, I think also in other locations. The problem is that some of the softwares that teachers want to use to teach in remote settings, it doesn't work as well on the Chromebook.
Mm.
And it is essential at this point in time that the software teachers are using to teach functions on the machines that children have in their homes,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
and function well.
And
Yeah.
function well. There's no reason why I cannot find a reason why we can't adapt the softwares. I mean, I'm not a designer, I'm not a programmer, but I bet there are folks out there who could solve these problems. And I'm not sure why it's, you know, what is it, 6 months now into virtual learning, and we haven't stepped up to this yet. Um, I
Yeah.
think we need some additional technology. So as a math teacher, I can tell you something that's really difficult for me. Even in my work as a educator of mathematics pre-service teachers, right,
Mhm.
or pre-service mathematics teachers, I can't see their work. I need to see notebooks. I need to see paper. I need to see there's something really organic and wonderful that happens between paper and pen, that I cannot seem to get to work for myself in a remote setting. There are
Mhm.
some technologies I've used, like Google offers Jamboard, um, which is a good tool to use. I've been able to use it a few times and with some level of success, but it's clunky when it comes to writing. Unless I have a really fancy tablet with a really fancy stylus, I'm unable to use this as a tool for writing.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
I've had a colleague set up their iPhone as their second Zoom account, and the iPhone shines down on their work, and then we can actually see hands moving.
Oh, that's yes, that's cool.
So there's a workaround, but I think we actually need more of, in that, I think we need more tools to make the virtual space work.
I mean, yeah, this is definitely pushing us all to be more tech
Right.
savvy,
Right.
which is
Like,
good, right? Because
yeah.
technology is the future. I mean, technology is now, but also the future.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of room here to experiment. I think that there's large organizations, large foundations love to fund grants for innovation, educational innovation. And so I think it would be wonderful if we could see some more smaller grants,
mhm.
um, happen so that people can test in smaller ways technologies that work, right?
Mhm.
Strategies that work, and then share broadly.
Definitely, definitely. How do we mitigate this anxiety around e-learning technology? Our students, now in e-learning settings? Because we don't know how long this is going to last for, maybe the next year. So, how do we mitigate this anxiety? Or do you think that students and teachers have anxiety surrounding e-learning? Do you see that?
Absolutely. Question two, yes, 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 1,000 times yes. The stress and anxiety associated with having to teach and learn in a remote setting, it
Hmm.
extends beyond teacher and student, it extends to families. We're seeing families struggling to get their young people to engage in this virtual way with school. It feels so unnatural.
Yeah.
And so what I think has happened is we have tried to simply remix what we were doing in person for the online space. And there's two problems with that. I think in many spaces, what we were doing in person, it kind of wasn't working in some spaces. There's a lot of places where learning is beautiful and rich and it's really happening. But
Mhm.
in a lot of spaces, even when we were in person, we were seeing kids who were not engaged. We were seeing kids who were failing. Um,
Yeah.
and we were seeing kind of this myth of the meritocracy really sort of taking strong hold in spaces and causing extremely unequal, inequitable outcomes. So that's problem number one. If we're trying to remix what already existed, maybe we need to analyze what already existed in a different way because it wasn't working, parts of it, right? This heavy emphasis on testing needs to change. It absolutely needs to change. So that's part one. Part two is I think that this is the time to sort of let's just sort of relax some of the mandates on teachers and students. let's actually go with a more humane approach. What is doable? What is reasonable? We've got young people who are on sitting at a desk on camera for like 4, 5, 6 hours a day. That's very different from being in an actual physical classroom for 4, 5, 6 hours a day.
Definitely.
You know, I don't know about your experience, but in mine, and as a teacher as well, in a 90-minute period, I would absolutely have students getting up out of their seats and moving around,
Oh yeah.
and absolutely talking to each other, you know, and not just having to listen for the entire time,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. For
right?
sure.
And
Yeah.
there was also this sort of, in my classroom, it was a huge part of the work I did was around building classroom community,
Mm.
classroom culture.
There's none of that in
There's
Zoom.
none of that. There's none of that. So we sort of need to really rethink um, the way that mandates are operating and the way that the school policies are sort of forcing people to stay seated and engaged in Zoom. Um, yeah, it's very stress provoking, I find,
Yeah. Yeah, on both sides.
on both sides, on in the spaces that we don't see. So in the family life that's not on Zoom,
Mhm. Mhm.
there's
Definitely.
also significant stress.
So I have one more question for you because I know you have to go soon.
Mhm.
But in e-learning, normal school, just in school in general,
Mhm.
what do you think we're not teaching our students? Like we have English, we have math, we have social studies, all the subjects, art, music, all these electives.
Mhm.
But in my opinion, I feel like schools are not teaching students to just be themselves, like
Mm.
self-expression. Do you think, like, what do you think is lacking in schools? And also, in conjunction with that, do you think schools should be specialized earlier? Do you think kids need to learn all of these subjects? And also, I'm going to add this one. I just thought of it. Do you think it's necessary to go to college?
These
A
are
loaded
tough
question.
questions. Okay, so I'll start with the last one first. This idea of having to go to college.
Mhm.
Um, right now, in my mind, what's happening is the price of an undergraduate degree in this country, it is exorbitant and outrageous.
Crazy.
And we do not need to be saddling young people and their families with, you know, insurmountable debt so that they can get a degree from a specific named university. I mean, we even have famous people going to jail,
I know.
right? And famous people getting tried for cheating to get their kids into a specific school. So I think that college is the prime and perfect example of exactly what is wrong with an education system that's built on meritocratic ideologies. There
Yeah.
is no such thing as work really hard and get ahead if your parents can pay certain premiums to get you into schools,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
right? There is no work hard and you will get ahead if in your school there simply aren't the opportunities for you to engage in extracurriculars which now seem quite necessary for the college application. So is college necessary? I think that there is a sad truth around its necessity to secure certain jobs and to have access to certain types of futures. And I think that that's a problem with our society, you know, in general. Um, but in terms of kind of coming back to like, well, what could we do earlier in
Mhm.
schools? I think your question was, what's missing? Like
Yeah.
we have those disciplines, right? We have our math, our science. You know, we have these disciplines that we study in school. Um, I think that we need to change how some of those disciplines are structured,
Okay.
right? So I think that there should be more of a push for like interdisciplinary study.
Mm.
You
Okay.
can't, it's impossible to do certain kinds of science without math.
Yeah.
And if you talk to middle school teachers in math and science, they're always kind of scratching their heads like, how is it kids don't know how to do this yet, you know?
Mhm.
And so, wouldn't it be cool if we could have a true interdisciplinary approach, a true problem-based approach to teaching and learning? What that would mean, though, is that this has to go all the way back to how we prepare teachers and all the way back to how we think about the standards for learning.
Yes, exactly.
It's a this idea of mine to move to a truly interdisciplinary form of study in schools, to allow it to be more problem based, and in the earlier grades to allow for school to be more play based.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's going to take a dramatic re, redesign of how we approach education. So if you there are some aspects of how schools are set up today that date back, to pre-industrial society.
Mhm.
And we society has come a long way since then. So why do
Yeah.
schools still look the same? It's
Yeah.
silly.
Mhm.
I'll give you a couple of examples of things that kind of don't make sense anymore.
Please.
Um, I don't think summer vacation makes very good sense.
Mm.
So we have our school calendar based on the agrarian calendar. And so at some point in this nation's history, kids needed to go home for the summers and help out on the farms. And that's why there was summer vacation, because the days were longer, you needed more help in the fields. That's not the case for the majority of people. Maybe it is the case for some, but I think that for the large majority of people in this country, it would make more sense to get away from an agrarian school calendar and move toward a 12-month calendar.
Oh, really?
There's lots of really great models out there, like 3 weeks on, 1 week off, 3 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and you can cycle.
Mhm. So you're integrating vacation into the 12 month. Yeah. So you're having, it's a balance. It's a good balance and it's a good example of what adult life is.
Yes, it really is. And guess what? The kids are going to feel so much less stress because they're going to get a break. And the teachers
Mhm.
are going to come back refreshed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and if you're teaching units of study, let's say you teach a 3-week unit on, adding and subtracting fractions, invariably you're going to have a small group of children who need some more help with this topic.
Mhm.
Maybe they have some lagging skills. It's really hard in a school year that just is week to week to week, back to back to back, to make that time and work with kids on stuff that they need immediately. Whereas if I had 3 weeks on and 1 week off, maybe I would choose to take on some overtime as a teacher. And maybe in one of those weeks, I would pull in some kids who needed some additional help and get to them in a more timely manner.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's one thing. The calendar make no sense. Another thing I think doesn't wholly make sense to me is that Sir Ken Robinson talks about this in some of his videos I've seen. But why do we group kids by age? Have you met any 2 6-year-olds that are the same academically, socially,
Mm.
emotionally, physically? It's silly. I think that we can group children not by age, but by readiness, by developmental stage.
Mm.
So you have groups of kids maybe who move together for a couple of years, who maybe aren't all the exact same age.
Mhm. Mhm. But wouldn't that require more testing?
I think it would require more assessment.
Okay.
I think there's a whole group of people who we could tap into to help us with that. There's the entire group of the children's families and caregivers would probably be able to give us a very good sense of where they think their children should be.
Okay. Okay.
I think that that's I'm always amazed. One of the things I would do as a classroom teacher, and my parents always love this, my caregivers always love this. I would send home a survey
Mhm.
to the parents, and I would say, tell me 2 things that your child is really good at. And the things that these parents would write, oh, it gives me goosebumps just to think. I would just pour over it, and it was just it was just incredible to sort of learn how parents held their children, in such high regard. It was beautiful, beautiful.
Okay. So you would basically find the caregivers or anybody who's close to the children, and then have them answer questions and see how
Mhm.
the child is developmentally.
Yes, along with some experts who definitely know a lot more than I do in the fields
Assessments.
of, psychology, and who could come in and kind of give a like a social emotional readiness kind of assessment.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't need cutoff scores, but maybe we need continuums.
Okay. Okay. That works. Yeah.
Those are a couple things. I got more to say about that, but those are just a couple of the things I would do.
Yeah. No, no, please elaborate on it. This is our last question. So,
Okay. Um, I mean, I said it before earlier. I alluded to it, but I think that I think what else we need to focus on more is making school a little bit more joyful. There
yeah.
needs to be more time, and the way that we're going to accomplish schools becoming more joyful spaces is by really kind of re-examining the role that testing plays, and by providing teachers with additional professional support. So give the teachers the time they need to learn their content area more deeply. There's this thing that's called like content knowledge, right? It's
Mhm.
like, okay, I know all this stuff about math. Like I can do math and I can do it well. But then there's something separate called pedagogical content knowledge. And that is this body of knowledge that has to do with how people learn math.
Yeah.
And there's overlap
It's
between the two,
key.
certainly. But there is a lot there that teachers need to sort of continually be improving upon, and continually being exposed to new research and new strategies, new ideas for how to reach kids. So we sort of need more. I would put a lot more time and effort into giving teachers the space to study their own craft.
Yeah, definitely working from the ground up
Mhm,
with
mhm.
teachers and training teachers, because I feel like that's just without a good teacher, there are no bad students, just bad, right? I don't want to say bad, but there are no, I guess, ineffective students, just ineffective teachers. So
And I would push and say that there's rarely an ineffective teacher. There are a lot of teachers who, with a little love and support, could be stellar.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Those key elements are very, very crucial. Thank
Mhm.
you so much.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of questions